I bought a haunted house. In 1999, I was in my mid-40s and had just escaped from my stressful and joyless career as a management consultant. I needed a project. I loved small period buildings and decided to throw my energy into restoring one. I started combing through auction catalogs in search of a place. Having failed to win a number of London houses that didn't much inspire me anyway, I cast the net wider. My father would often give me advice over the phone. He persuaded me to focus on Derbyshire, a county my family has a strong connection to, and helped me identify what my ideal house would be like: stone-built, a south-facing garden, with at least 2 bedrooms and a workshop. One night, we just finished a long conversation about this elusive dream home when Dad, a healthy 75-year-old, had a heart attack. He died instantly. I didn't look at any more auction catalogs until after the funeral. When I did, I spotted Lowe's Cottage straight away. Located in the Derbyshire Dales village of Upper Mayfield, it was built late in the 18th century by a stonemason who needed a home with a workshop. It seemed exactly like the place my father had described. I drove out to view it the day before the auction. The cottage was approached over the ominously titled Hanging Bridge and Gallows Tree Lane. The house itself was named after a nearby Iron Age burial mound. Perhaps I should have felt a sense of foreboding, especially when the agent wouldn't let me use my video camera inside the house. But the cottage had everything I'd been looking for, with the added attraction of bewitching Peak District views. I was delighted by it. The following day, I turned up at the auction to find a camera crew present and a tangible buzz in the room. The hammer came down after I'd bid £6,000 over the guide price. I'd barely had time to process the fact that I'd won before I was ushered into an anteroom full of reporters. A microphone was thrust towards me and someone asked, "How does it feel to have bought England's most haunted cottage?" I had no idea of the house's reputation. There was no hint of it in the description, but I was quickly brought up to speed. A couple, Andrew and Josie Smith, who had bought Lowe's Cottage in 1994, had filed a lawsuit against the previous owners for not telling them the property was haunted. The Smiths claimed they had been driven out by a number of manifestations, including something they described as the creeping presence, like a mist that appeared and thickened into the fog. They spoke of sudden pockets of cold, damp patches on the wall and objects inexplicably moving. Their claims were backed up by a vicar, who investigated the cottage and said he found a pungent odor that moved around and a wall that seemed to weep when he placed his hand on it. It was reported to be the first case relying on the existence of supernatural forces since the Middle Ages, but the judge gave the Smiths' claims short shrift. During my first night in Lowe's Cottage, I started to have some sympathy for my predecessors. My colleague, Cyan, was uneasy entering the house and found it hard to settle. Lights switched on and off, there were sudden changes in temperature, and my TV would turn itself on. There were further incidents. I was visited by reporters who experienced problems with tape recorders or cameras. I remembered the agent who had forbidden filming when I first visited, and when mysterious patches of glistening moisture started forming on walls, I recalled the vicar's description of a weeping wall. It felt almost as if Lowe's Cottage had a personality and was testing me in some way. The place seemed capable of changing moods, though I never had any sense of a malignant entity. I later got to meet the Smiths and found them to be solid and authentic people. After a while, Cyan seemed to make peace with the house, and the perplexing incidents stopped. I spent a happy 4 years at the cottage before renting it out. Only one of the tenants has reported anything unusual. In the months after the auction, some people told me the house would be a blessing to me, and they were right. In spite of its notoriety, I'm very grateful to Lowe's Cottage. Seemingly prophesied by my father, it acted as a pivot between an unhappy time in my life and my more fulfilling existence restoring period properties. Halmich Park. This happened about 10 years ago. I've always liked ghosts and paranormal activity, way before the movie franchise came out. I have two close friends at work, John and CJ, who are interested in ghost hunting. We watched the ghost hunting shows, which were becoming big at the time. Being correction officers, we worked in a high-stress landscape and loved the idea of blowing off some steam by possibly getting some EVPs or maybe even some video evidence of the beyond. We called ourselves SSPI, which stood for Spurt Shot Paranormal Investigations. We would be drinking during our trips to supposedly haunted places in our local area of Southeast Michigan. It was fun. We followed any lead we got from friends. We hear this place is haunted, that place is haunted, weird noises are coming from the basement, etc. We didn't really believe any of these stories, but we wanted a chance to hang out and enjoy our off time from a real intense workday. One of John's friends told us his small meat packing plant had a dark past. Weird noises were coming from the unused basement. John and I set up, while CJ flirted with the receptionist up front. We hit the EVP and started our questions. Is there anyone here with us? Nothing. This basement was small, with a little more room than a crawl space. And it smelled like death, animal death to be more specific. Brushing the obvious pig and bovine blood smell aside, me and John kept steady. What do you want us to know? I said. We both heard a short whisper. Giving each other the universal "did you hear that?" look to each other, we decided to crawl back up the stairs and review the audio recording. That's when we heard a voice say something like, "Get the gun, the gun." It didn't make sense at first, until we realized we were both carrying our issued SIG P226 sidearms. Not sure why that was said, but it was surely intriguing. After a few more pieces of evidence like this, I wanted to do some research of the local area. I looked at Haunted Michigan online, finding that we were only miles away from Halmich Park in Warren, Michigan. The stories ranged from scary to absolutely ridiculous. The legend goes that if you pull into the park at midnight, you will see tail lights leaving the park. As soon as you see it, it disappears. Driving further, you immediately feel something hit the front of your car. Do not leave the vehicle, the site says. Pretty generic urban legends that I'm sure most towns have, but I decided to check it out myself with my SSPI buddies. Oh, there are also some stories about softball players intentionally trying to hit and kill kids with home run balls. Yeah, you can find that story if you want, it's just a little too silly for me. We pulled in after work. It was about 11 p.m., totally dark. Save a few lampposts in the park. As soon as we pulled in, I swear to you I did see tail lights leaving the park. Squinting, I asked if the other guys saw that car. No, they both said. I was pretty sure they were messing with me, so I brushed it off. Yeah, this place is pretty boom. I fucking hit something. Or something hit me. I was mortified now. Slamming on the brakes and throwing my 1998 Mustang into the park, I threw the door open and ran to check out the damage, hoping and praying to God I didn't hit a human being. Nothing. Walking back to the car, I saw it, a speed bump. A pretty massive one at that. A huge sigh of relief left my lungs. I see what the issue was. There's only one way into this park, and the road goes straight through to the other side, which means you aren't supposed to turn around a one-way road. So seeing the tail lights kind of makes sense. If you don't know any better, and it's pitch black, you won't notice the speed bump. Some online hipsters turned this into hitting a ghost kid or something. Clever, actually. We all decided to pick an area of the park to sit in and try to get some EVPs. I decided to sit on the merry-go-round. It's been a while since I've seen one, let alone actually ridden one. The park wasn't inherently scary. It was dark, but I felt no ominous tone, no evil in the air, and definitely did not hear any demon children playing or laughing in the distance. I asked a few basic questions. Is there anyone here with me? What is your name? Does anyone or anything want to communicate with me? Silence. I gave it another 10 minutes and decided to find my friends and head home. Not as fun as I thought it would be. It should have been easy to find them. The park is not that big. I looked all over for them. I started calling them, in a normal tone at first, then screaming. Something made me click the recorder back on. I only asked one more question. What is going on here? A blast of wind hit me right in the face. I was so panicked I sprinted to my car. At this point, I didn't even care if I left those guys behind. Serves them right for trying to mess with me. As I saw the green Mustang appear, the relief was overwhelming. Finally, in the car, I attempted to catch my breath. What's wrong with you? Letting out a yelp that I am not at all proud of, I look to my right and see John sitting there, with a confused look. Looking in the rear view, I see CJ in the back, also confused. They both started roaring with laughter. What the hell, man? Did you guys leave and get right back into the car as soon as you saw where I went? What? John said, we've been here the whole time. What the hell are you on, bro? That night, not wanting to even think about what happened, I decided against my better judgment to check the recorder and see if I got anything. I didn't get much, just the normal sounds of nature. Until that moment, everything changed. Remember I said I felt a huge blast of wind hit me? I don't think it was wind. When I asked what was going on here, I hear what sounds like someone violently inhaling. After the inhale they say, "Death, move." I have not and will not be back there. The creepy neighbor children. Around the age of 4, when I was living in Sunrise, Florida, it was known within my family that my aunt's house was haunted. I spent quite a bit of time there as a kid as she would babysit for me. I always had a good time with her and have fond memories of being at her house. I was spoiled by my aunts and uncles since I was the first baby. She always got me the best toys, had the best snacks, and I loved hanging out with the kids who lived next door to her, the oldest, Luba, and her little sister, Happy. Now that I'm an adult, I understand how strange those names are, but never really occurred to me as a kid. Anyways, they always seemed to be there when I was there. I have vivid memories of all of us sitting in my little mermaid tent laughing and playing house. My aunt had 2 dogs that would just sit there while we brushed their hair with Barbie combs and put bows in their hair. We called it a dog makeover. We often did typical kid things. Luba and Happy were such pranksters. Sometimes, They would move the dog's food bowls across the kitchen or turn on a toy so it made noises, hide it, and run away just to laugh at my aunt going nuts looking for it. She always seemed confused by the silly pranks, and as kids, that just made us laugh. One time, we were hanging out in the tent while my aunt had been vacuuming the living room. Had turned off the vacuum and walked away to do something in another room. We had convinced ourselves if we turned it on and it stayed in one spot that it would suck all the way through to the other side of the earth. So, Luba ran over to the vacuum, turned it on, and ran back to the tent. We peered out the plastic window of the tent and laughed while my aunt threw up her arms and yelled my name out in frustration. I always remember thinking it was always me who was catching all the blame, but figured my aunt just didn't want to yell at the neighbor kids. Over time, Luba and Happy showed up less and less. I thought they were either at school or busy and weren't able to come over as often. After all, we were getting older and I also was not at my aunt's house as often. After so long of not seeing them, I chalked it up to the fact they had moved away. Eventually, my aunt had her own kids and raised them in that house until they were around 4 or 5 years old before they moved out of state. Life had gone on as it does, and Luba and Happy were just a fond memory that I would often think back on and wonder how they were doing or where they were at in life. Fast forward to 10 years later. I'm about 14 or 15 years old. Our family had all lived in different states at this point, so when we would gather around the holidays, we always had catching up to do and walks to take down memory lane. A conversation came up about childhood friends between my mom and aunt, and all the memories of Luba and Happy came flooding back to me. I was thinking to myself, I wonder if my aunt might know where they are at now. So, I chimed in and asked her if she remembered Luba and Happy. She contemplated it for a moment. You could see her trying to think about it. She asked me with a very confused look on her face, Luba? Happy? I have never known any kids with such strange names. I went over everything I knew about them. You know, the neighbors by your house in Florida, the ones always messing with you, and you would blame me. My mom snapped her fingers and said, "Oh, at the haunted house?" I was very confused when she said this, as I had no knowledge of her house being haunted. My aunt, still looking confused, responded that house was definitely creepy. I don't remember any kids ever being there other than you and your cousins. You had imaginary friends? I was absolutely certain that these friends were not imaginary. After all, I knew as a kid that other kids often had imaginary friends, and I would wonder how it that even possible to create an image of a whole person in your head. I insisted that they were actually there. I knew they were there. But she seemed very set on the fact they were not. She and my mom started going back and forth. Remember, the dog bowls would just slide across the kitchen floor, or the toys in the other room turning on at the bottom of the toy box. I literally just sat there and could not believe what they were saying. I thought for sure they had lost their minds due to old age. Those kids were there. They moved the dog bowl and played all the pranks. I saw it with my own eyes. My aunt told me there were definitely a lot of creepy things that happened in that house. At first, I thought you had been behind all the things turning on and off or moving around, because I had to rationalize it. I realized after some time that something weird was going on, but decided to ignore it since I really don't believe in that kind of stuff anyways. My jaw was on the floor, folks. I was so creeped out. I was so confused. I had imaginary friends. What? My family was all in agreement about the ghosts in the house, nodding and reassuring each other. I finally said out loud, "So, I had imaginary friends named Luba and Happy?" I need to be in therapy. About this time, my cousin had rounded the corner to the dining room we were all sitting in and in the giddiest voice said, "Luba and Happy." They were my friends. We all kind of looked at her in silence and then looked at each other before someone blurted out, "Wait, you saw Luba and Happy too?" Without missing a beat and not realizing what the big deal was, my cousin confirmed to us, of course, they were always at my house and always in my playroom. They used to play pranks on Mom. Everyone sat in shock. Nothing made sense. All the kids in my family who had set foot in that house over the years knew Luba and Happy. I don't think the odds are that great of having the same imaginary friends your cousin did years apart. We filled my cousin in on the haunting of the house. She was equally as creeped out, and you could see a little shiver of fear go down her spine right before she said, "I always wondered how they could go in and out through the walls of the playroom." I used to live in a haunted house. So when I was living with my mom and stepdad, who was abusive, my mom used to swear our house was haunted. The first experience was when she was in my parents' bathroom, which was connected to a closet that you could enter from both sides of the bathroom. She went in there and she saw what she said looked like a woman's spirit crying on the floor. She told me she walked over to the spirit and asked if it needed help. She said the spirit was trapped and wanted out or something like that. Anyways, that scared me shitless and I didn't like going in that bathroom anymore. The next experience was, well, my mom and experienced this together. So we would smell someone cooking food, but no one was in there. This could have been explained by the vents letting in outside air, but we still don't know. By the way, we are heavily Catholic, and so we have a lot of crosses around our house. Anyways, I had 3 crosses and an evil eye in my room at the time. So I went out of my room to use the bathroom, which was right in between my mom and my room. And right where the bathroom is, there is the entranceway that opens up to the kitchen. So basically, I had a full view of that kitchen when I got out of the bathroom. Keep in mind that it is pitch black in there except for a light over the stove and a light on in the entryway. So I'm looking at the kitchen for a brief second and I see this tall, thin creature thing with black hollow eyes and a big black mouth. This thing kinda looked like SCP-096. I have myopia, I'm nearsighted, so it was pretty blurry. My glasses were off, or I didn't have them, I can't remember. So once I processed what the fuck I was looking at, I made a sonic dash to my room. I opened the door and looked back to close it and saw the thing peek around the corner. That was a hell no for me, so I slammed my door and practically flew into bed. I hid under the covers for a long time until I fell asleep. I have one more story though. I was in my bed, which was on stilts and was a queen, so I had to jump onto it, just drawing or reading. When I looked behind me into a painting I saw a black sock looking thing and it shook. It shook. At the time this terrified me and I still can't explain it. This is a little different than a paranormal experience, but it scared me. I woke up in the middle of the night to a dark figure looming over me, so I turned to my side so I couldn't look at it and I saw, I'm not joking, an old farmer standing right next to my bed looking concerned. I closed my eyes, then opened them, and he was gone. Still don't know if it was a dream or not, but it still was terrifying. Haunted house? When I was 22, I moved into a rental home in Harveys Lake, Pennsylvania. It was very small and somewhat run down. It reminded me of a cabin that you see on fishing trips. Honestly, I hated it but could not afford anything better at the time. The basement was creepy. The bathroom ceiling sloped downward so that the shower head was aimed at my chest and I could not stand to pee without my head touching the ceiling. The floor was also sloped, but hey, it was cheap with all utilities provided. Anyways, shortly after I had moved in, I had a dream one night. I dreamt in the third person, and at first, I assumed that what I was seeing was from my point of view. It was like I was floating towards my front door in the middle of a full, moonlit night. Once I got to the front door, a thin, pale hand turned the knob and slowly opened it. It wasn't my hand, so I now knew that I was seeing the vision of someone else. Slowly, I started walking towards my bedroom, which was the first room on the right immediately after the small kitchen, and I could see myself sleeping in my bed. My vision then slowly glided into my room and to the side of my bed by a window, and I was looking down at myself sleeping on my stomach. After a second, the thin pale hand reached down to grab me. Seeing myself about to be attacked, I violently woke from the dream and lashed out toward where the figure was standing, knocking things off a nightstand next to me, but there was no one there. Although I told myself that it was just a dream, I thought it was incredibly weird that there was no difference in the amount of darkness in my room. It was apparently a full moon visible right outside my window, and that made the room more blue and brighter than usual. It was exactly the same as in my dream. Most nights, it is very dark in my room. A week or so later, I had friends over. There was an old bar down the road that we could quickly walk to, so we got a little drunk and walked back to my place. We were watching a movie to pass the time so that my friends could sober up to drive home, but after a while, they all decided to just stay over. As we were watching the end of a movie, my friend's girlfriend woke up looking alarmed, like she was having a nightmare and was about to yell. We all looked at her and she just looked relieved to be awake. But she kept saying to her boyfriend, who was my best friend, "Come on, let's go. I want to go. I really don't want to be here." After a minute of him telling her that they could not drive, she calmed down and reluctantly agreed to stay. Nothing else happened, and in the morning, they all got up and drove home. She called me as soon as she got home to apologize. She was afraid that I got offended that she did not want to stay in my home, and I just laughed and told her that it was fine. No big deal. She then proceeded to tell me why she wanted to leave so badly. She said she fell asleep and had a dream that some pale, evil-looking lady who resembled a demonic witch dressed in black grabbed her in the apartment and was dragging her away across the floor. It was very violent apparently, but she woke up in the middle of the nightmare. She said it was the scariest thing she ever saw. I thought she was joking with me until I realized that I told no one of my similar dream. I then told her about my dream and she freaked out and spent days doing research into the area and home, thinking something bad had happened there, but found nothing. She never came over again after that, but it didn't matter. I was out of there within a few months and the house was torn down about 10 years later. Our haunted house. This happened when I was still in primary school, about 8 or 9 years old. We lived in a house that I can only describe as being haunted. Several strange things happened in this house, but I'm going to tell you one of the creepiest ones that I remember. My brothers and I used to make our rendition of a Friday bed, which basically consisted of moving their two single beds side by side, close enough to each other so we could put a mattress in the middle, making the mattress into a UU shape and sleeping weird according to us. The one Friday night we did just that, and it was all fun and games. We stayed up late talking and fooling around as kids do, and eventually fell asleep. To understand this story, you need a little background on my youngest brother. He was a little brat, or we saw him as one at least. He was always moaning or crying about something, and this drove everybody crazy. After we all fell asleep, my oldest brother and I awoke to my little brother standing behind the curtain with his back to us and a blanket covering his head like a hoodie and covering his body. It seemed like he was just standing there looking out of the window, and of course, he was crying. We were so used to this type of behavior that our reaction was to tell him to shut up and to get back in bed because he was annoying us and we just wanted to sleep. Our mother in the next room heard him too, because she also yelled at him to shut up and get back into bed. He didn't respond. After a few seconds of calling his name, he said in his sleepy, groggy voice, "What?" We realized that he was still lying next to us fast asleep. Whoever or whatever was standing behind the curtain sounded exactly like my brother when he cried, which is why we thought it was him. The crying stopped, but the figure still stood there with the blanket. We were so scared that we just covered our heads and eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, the blanket that the figure had was just lying on the floor behind the curtain. I still can't explain it, but it still gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. Growing up in a haunted house. I'm 26 now, but this happened between the ages of 7 and 14. I grew up in a small town in New England called Claremont. My father was in the Navy. We moved to a lot of newly developed areas before coming to Claremont. A little history about the place. Claremont was settled in 1762. And many houses built there were built by original owners and by their or their friends' hands. A lot still stands today. The house I grew up in was also right next to a cemetery with the most recent date of 1848. The house I grew up in was built in the 1800s. So, back to telling a few of my encounters in the house. When we first moved there, everything was fine and dandy. Ran around the house, played, ate, and slept. After about a year of living there, the vibes were just different. I thought it was me being a kid and watching a couple of scary movies with my mom. I thought it was my mind. But I could just feel the energy shift in the house. During the day things were okay, then things started happening at night. Nothing too bad. I'd hear footsteps going back and forth in the attic when I'd be trying to sleep. I remember staring at the ceiling for 5 minutes the first time it happened. After 5 minutes, I put my invisible shield on, my blanket over my head. I was terrified, but eventually fell asleep. This happened for a few weeks until I started waking up in the middle of the night. I would wake up to the feeling of being watched very intensely. Now, since the first sound of footsteps, I have been sleeping with my blanket over my head every night. So when I would wake up to the feeling, I'd try to get back to sleep as soon as possible because I hated that feeling of being watched. One night when this happened, I couldn't fall back asleep. After about 30 minutes, I had to use the bathroom. The bathroom is only right outside of my bedroom door. I decided to take my blanket off of my head slowly. When I got it off my head, I saw a dark figure watching me from my doorway. I immediately went back under my blanket, and I'm pretty sure I wet the bed that night. I was so scared. The dark figure would show up in my doorway every other night for the next few months. I didn't say anything to my parents because, again, I thought it was my kid's mind. I'll note, I was the only one to sleep with the door open. I started closing it after a few months and never woke up to that uneasy feeling of being watched. Another incident, I was a little older now, about 9 to 10 years old. My brother started dating this girl. I'll call her Amanda. Amanda would spend the night frequently and then go off to work during the day. This is important. On this day, I stayed home from school pretending to be sick. Classic me. Amanda woke up and we made some breakfast and said our goodbyes. I watched her little green Ford Focus drive up the hill and out of sight. After a couple of hours of playing good old RuneScape on the computer, I get up to make some lunch. I'm in the kitchen, home alone, dog asleep. I hear someone call my name Elizabeth, very drawn out and slow. I panicked and thought to myself, who the hell stayed home? A few minutes go by and I'm checking the whole house top to bottom. No one. Not a single soul. I go back into the kitchen and finish making my sandwich. Again, I hear a voice say my name. At this point, I nope right out of there and spent the day outside until my brother got home from work. A couple of weeks go by and Amanda is home alone on her day off. She was telling me about the same voice saying her name while she was in the kitchen. Again, I didn't tell anyone about this. I tended to lie as a kid, but it was only when I took something I knew I shouldn't have. Nothing like this. I wouldn't lie over fear. I told her everything that happened to me prior to this. We both looked terrified of the unknown. I was about 13 at this point. My father and mother separated. My brother went into the National Guard and I moved in with my father. My mother and 3 sisters stayed in that house. I remember visiting for a couple of weeks on Christmas vacation. My sister and I were hanging up Christmas lights in her bedroom. We were talking, singing, dancing, just doing the teenage girl thing while listening to music. We sat down for a little bit to relax. When I stood up to grab a set of lights that were further away on the floor, I noticed 4 drops of blood. I looked up and saw nothing. I looked at myself and saw nothing. My sister looked over herself, but again nothing. We both took off our clothes to make sure each other was not bleeding. Nothing. There was no place this blood had come from. No one and nothing had come in or out of that bedroom. We screamed for our mom to come to the bedroom. Our mom thought we were playing a joke on her and that it was fake blood. My sister and I were in tears because we were so scared. My mom got something to clean it up with and then noticed it was in fact real. My sister's room had a door to the attic, which is where all of the noise comes from. Another time in my sister's room we were hanging out, watching a movie with our other sister. We were all on her bed, which was blocking off the door to the attic. The TV and entertainment center was a good 6 feet away. I remember my sister having a Spider-Man action figure on the way top of this entertainment center. Midway through the movie, that Spider-Man action figure flew off the top of the entertainment center and landed on me. On the bed, I didn't like that house much, and I'm glad I didn't live there for as long as they all did. I never went back to that house to live, but I did go to visit when my father moved back in and everyone left. I stayed in my sister's old room with the attic door. I never could sleep in that room. As a kid or teenager. I'm sure as an adult I wouldn't be able to. It's a neat house with a lot of history, but I'll just keep reading books from the library instead of going back to find out more. I grew up in a haunted house. I lived in the same house from when I was born until I was 10 years old. It was a pretty typical suburban home. It was not particularly old and was finished with all of the cheap outfitting that is typically used to cut down on costs in mass-produced homes. It was unremarkable. It was a little box made of ticky-tacky in an area full of little boxes that all looked the same, so to speak. It had a finished basement that was filled with toys. It was what should be a child's paradise. There were 2 rooms there. One was what we considered the main room, which was the room that you first walked into when coming down the stairs and had a TV, computer, and a pull-out couch that was great for sleepovers. The other was what we considered the back room. It was smaller with many toy-filled bins. It was essentially a playroom for me and my siblings. It had a whiteboard on the only wall that wasn't nearly entirely taken up by sliding doors to small storage and utility rooms. I would spend hours down there, often alone, while my mom went about her business upstairs. I spent a lot of time, particularly in the back room, playing with dolls or whatever little girls do, until an uneasy feeling would force me back upstairs to the safety of my mother's side. This would happen just about every time I played down there. I would play until I got too scared, and then I would flee upstairs. I didn't put much thought into my uneasy feeling because it had happened in that room for my entire life, and 4-year-olds tend to not think too much about those things. Looking back at it, I understand the fear and uneasiness I felt in that room. I felt like I was being watched. The feeling was strongest when I was alone in that back room, but I would still feel it when I was in the main room or with people. A prime example of this is the sleepovers I would have when I was a bit older, about 7 years old. I always had sleepovers in the main room because it had a pull-out couch and a TV. The pull-out couch was situated as far away from the doorway to the back room as possible, but still had a clear sight line to it. I would always take the spot furthest away from the back room's doorway in an attempt to get away from the uneasiness that room caused, especially at night. I felt like I was being watched on those late nights, and I would look up to the doorway and expect to see a woman standing there. Even though I never actually saw her with my eyes, it was like I saw her with my mind because, even now, I have a distinct mental image of her. She was tall, frail, and gaunt. She was an older woman, probably about 60 or 70, with a messy fizz of gray hair that went down to her shoulders. Her cheekbones were very pronounced, like she had not eaten in months, or like her flesh was starting to decay off of her bones. The thing that stood out the most was her eyes. They were dark and sunken, vacant with a 1,000-yard stare. I did not know it at the time, but after working at an assisted living facility and seeing dying people, I realized that she looked like she was dying, or perhaps already dead. She frightened me, but not as much as the other presence. The thought of the other presence still sends ice-cold terror through my veins, nearly 10 years later. I never saw him, not even mentally, but I felt the darkness he emitted. I think I could never picture what he looked like because he did not look like anything like he was inhuman and could shift into any form he pleased. He felt dark and powerful, like pure evil. I felt his presence strongest in the back room, especially when I felt like I was being watched. The dark, malicious energy was suffocating. There, I took special care to not look too closely at the slats of the doors that led to the storage rooms because I was afraid I would see his dark, faceless eyes staring back at me. I learned to not look too closely at the darkness. There were times when I avoided that room entirely, like late at night when everything felt amplified. There were also month-long periods when I could not go into that room alone. I don't exactly know why there were periods when I felt like I could and couldn't be there. Maybe I had exhausted my courage and needed time to build it back up again. Maybe there were certain periods where the presences were just stronger. These periods would frustrate my parents to no end because they dismissed my fears as childish nonsense. They had never spent a night in that basement the way I had with my sleepovers. They had never felt the gaunt woman's eyes on them as they slept. They had never felt the dark, malevolent energy that radiated from the back room in the middle of the night. Eventually, after moving out of that house, I began to think it was just childish nonsense too. I never actually saw anything unusual, so it was probably just my overactive childhood imagination, right? Well, that was what I thought until I brought it up to my sister years after moving out of there. My sister is 6 years older than me, so she was 16 when we moved out of that house. She was old enough to be over that sort of childishness. I had mentioned it to her to joke about how dumb I was as a kid and how my imagination must have gone into overdrive. I stopped in my tracks when she told me, deadly serious, no, that house was haunted. It wasn't just you. She and my brother, who was 14 when we moved, were fully convinced the place was haunted. Without me saying anything about the basement, she said that she and my brother thought the basement in particular was haunted. I took things a little more seriously after that conversation, but I wasn't entirely convinced. We were siblings after all and had talked to each other about the uneasiness in the basement when we lived there. We likely colored each other's perceptions and freaked each other out. At least that was what I thought until I brought this up to a childhood friend. This friend and I were pretty close in elementary school, but fell out of touch in middle and high school. We now go to the same college and have gotten more in touch because of it. One day when I was with her, I realized that she had been in that basement countless times while we played and had sleepovers. She should also be relatively unbiased because I never told her about the haunting at the time because I didn't want to scare my friends off. I mentioned my conversation with my sister to her, and she was unsurprised. She told me that she had thought the house, and the basement in particular, was haunted. She hadn't told me at the time because she didn't want to freak me out. She went on to say that the back room was where it was the worst. I did not tell her that my siblings and I thought the basement was the most haunted part of the house, much less anything about the back room. Needless to say, I took things more seriously after that. What really freaks me out is my nightmares. To this day, whenever I have paranormal nightmares, it is always in that basement or the hallway leading up to the basement door. I have had dreams where I went down the stairs at my current house, only for it to shift to the bottom of the stairs at my old house. When I walked down the hallway by the stairs and past the basement door, there was the woman floating ominously. In another nightmare that I had, I turned into a grotesque and mangled monster, and I was inexplicably drawn down that hallway toward the basement. It was like I knew that was where monsters belonged. These nightmares freak me out because dreams are often used by your brain to sort through information and trauma. When I had these dreams, I had just about forgotten about that basement, and I have only recently pieced all of this together. It is entirely possible that I had an experience that scared me to the point of trauma in that basement, but I can't remember it because it is blocked from my memory. In that case, my brain may still be trying to work through it through my dreams. If that is true, I hope that memory never comes to the surface because some things are best left unknown. I never want to experience anything similar to that basement ever again because sometimes childhood fears are more than just childish nonsense. A farm haunted by native ghosts. Let me start by saying that this happened in Namibia, a small country in Africa. My late aunt's farm has always been rumored to be haunted. Personally, I didn't believe that because I hadn't been to her farm yet. One summer when I was 14 years old, my parents sent me and my two sisters to spend the holiday at my aunt's farm. I am 24 now. We made the 3-hour-long trip to my aunt's farm and got there around early noon since we journeyed in the morning. Nothing seemed amiss when we got there. My parents had to drive back to the city that same day, leaving my two sisters and me at the farm. All my cousins were there as well, so I didn't mind. That night we didn't do much. We had dinner and went to bed. Around midnight, all the dogs started to go berserk. They howled, barked, growled, and were just noisy altogether. I somehow fell asleep with all that going on. The next day came, and at night the same thing happened. I whispered to my cousin what is happening, and she just shushed me and told me to sleep. At that point, I did as she said. On day 3 of our visit, my cousins, sisters, and I decided to go into the forest to pass the time, and that's when I asked another cousin of mine what had happened the past 2 nights since it was our first time being on that farm. He said that the farm was haunted, and at midnight the spirits would start roaming around and the dogs saw them. That's why they'd go crazy. Of course, I didn't believe him. Later that night we had dinner and we sat around the fire just as kids. Half an hour later my sister asked us to follow her to my older cousin's house since she had charged her phone there, and it was just a short distance from my aunt's place because we didn't have electricity and he did. We spent a good 20 or so minutes there, and as we were on the way we heard the dogs bark again. It was midnight. We switched on her flash and walked back to my aunt's house, and that's when we saw 2 people walking towards us. They wore their native attire, and we wondered who still did that as people around there didn't wear native attire anymore and actually wore real clothes. The 2 people asked us where Kanjara, a town close to ours, was, and my cousins pointed out where they should go. They thanked us and continued to walk past us. We looked at each other and looked back at them, and they were gone. Nowhere to be seen, as if they disappeared into the night. We booked it back to my aunt's house because we had literally seen ghosts. I told my aunt the story the next day and believed them when they said the farm was haunted. The haunted house. It's Halloween night, and you and your group of friends see that there is a popular haunted house in your town, and all of your friends want to go. You want to impress your friends by going since it's rumored to be a horrifying haunted house, even more so than most other haunted houses. You all dress in your scariest costumes and start heading to the haunted house. You and your friends pull up into the parking lot of the haunted house, and you can already see that it seems authentic and horrifying. It looks like a big luxurious house painted to look like it's been abandoned for years. There's fake blood splattered all over the walls, bloody handprints on the cracked and chipped glass windows, fake cobwebs and spiders everywhere, and there's even a body bag just out of sight at the corner of the house. It's lying in a pool of fake blood. It's all pretty impressive, you gotta admit. You all start to head into the haunted house, and you can see that the creators went all out. There are fake bloody severed bodies everywhere, huge cobwebs with big hairy spiders to accompany them, bloodied weapons, axes, huge knives, chainsaws, etc., with bits of fake guts attached to them, and others. There's even a fog machine creating a thick white mist and strobe lights flickering overhead to add a spooky ambience. It's all pretty impressive, as it creates an unsettling and disturbing atmosphere. This place certainly doesn't disappoint. As you and your friends explore the haunted house, you see many different sights. For example, in the dining room, there are zombie animatronics sitting at the table with gauntlets filled with blood, organs spread on the plates, and a dismembered man animatronic sprawled across the middle of the table. It's painted to look as though there's blood spewing from its mouth, and it has a horrified expression on its face, with wide eyes and a screaming mouth. You're genuinely starting to get spooked by the sights, but trying to look brave in front of your friends, you laugh at a lot of the props. Eventually, as you're all walking through a section with scare actors dressed as popular serial killers, another actor dressed as Michael Myers is standing in the corner of a dark hallway, slightly obstructed by the wall while clutching a bloody machete, just staring at you and your friends. His mask and chainsaw look hyper-realistic. You notice the man first and bring him to the attention of your friends. You all playfully scream and laugh, but ultimately end up walking away without really saying anything else about that man. After a while, you and your friends start to get bored, so you all plan to go to your house to relax and hang out. Once you all get there, you start doing your favorite group activity. However, you felt like something was off. Like when you all were walking to your house, you felt like someone was watching and following you. You figured you were still pretty shaken up from the unsettling props back at the haunted house, so you just brushed it off as your mind played tricks on you. After a few hours of hanging out, your friends decide to start heading back to their houses. You bid them farewell and they leave. After they all leave, you head to your room to relax for the remainder of the night until you fall asleep. You put on some YouTube videos and eventually find yourself nodding off, eventually falling asleep to the YouTube videos still playing. You're suddenly awoken by the sound of shattering glass coming from somewhere in your house. You shoot up, confused and still half asleep. That doesn't last long, however, as the reality of shattering glass slowly comes to you. You always keep a baseball bat at the side of your bed just in case you feel like you need it, so you grab it and start slowly creeping your way out of your room to investigate the noise. You eventually make it to your living room and see the big glass window has been shattered, with shards of broken glass sparkling like glitter on the floor. It's a warm, breezy night, so you know there's no way this could be an accident. You can feel your fight or flight activate as the situation starts to sink in. There's somebody in your house. You clutch your bat tighter as your breathing gets heavier and your heartbeat quickens. You then hear a few thuds coming from your bedroom. Whoever it was, they were looking for you. And you had a gut feeling they didn't have the best intentions. You hear heavy footsteps sprinting towards the living room. The person must have realized you're not in your room. You're frozen with fear, unable to do anything except stand there and shiver with terror. You can hear the footsteps increase in volume as they come closer and closer. Suddenly, they stop, and the house falls silent, with the exception of crickets chirping in the night. You can feel the coldness of metal on your neck, as a huge machete is pressed against your throat, while heavy breathing can be heard from behind you.